This is the Business Stuff Podcast. This is where I will share the lessons I've learned from advising thousands of businesses over almost 30 years. Each episode will give you practical insight to allow you to learn from other people's mistakes. I'll be pulling in experts from our team and the world of business, and together we'll make sure your business is giving you what you want. My name is Martin, and this is the Business Stuff Podcast. Hi and welcome to this week's episode of Business Stuff. I'm here with Jack again from the Accelerator team, and we thought we'd do something quite topical. So Jack, we're going to talk about economic growth, what GDP is, what businesses can do, and what they need to just accept that sometimes things are out of your control.
Yeah, I feel like that is probably the biggest takeaway from this, is that probably a lot of this stuff is out of their control, but it's great to have an awareness of that stuff.
At least we can understand on the wider kind of, scale what's going on and why these things are happening.
And you can at least understand what the pundits are talking about when they're kind of going, "This is a terrible decision, dreadful decision, This is going to ruin us." You can understand why.
Yeah, okay then. So this is in the backdrop of course, we're recording this a couple of days after Rishi was announced. We've had, 44 days of Truss, who kind of did exactly what she said she was going to do. The markets didn't like it. Hunt stood up, gave a different kind of,
rolled back on everything.
Rolled back 90%, certainly, 95%. There's only one or two legacy issues have survived. We're not here to talk about the budget really, but it's quite interesting that one thing I think you can say is, to be fair, she did do exactly what she campaigned to do, but the markets didn't like it.
Yeah.
People are probably wondering, well, why? What was the issue? Mm-hmm. And she kind of said, well, we'll go for growth and we'll be all right. And I can only imagine then there wasn't the same confidence that growth would happen. Is that as simple as?
Yeah, I think in terms of how economic growth is measured, a lot of it is based on confidence. There are some levers that the government can pull in order to stimulate growth, and we'll probably talk about a couple of those. But essentially, it is a confidence thing, and as the government's undoing here was how the market reacted. As you said, everything fell apart. I mean, we don't want to get too political here, Martin, but there's probably an element of the media sensationalising some of it, because some of the stuff in terms of the value of the pound, that was already happening before. But
yeah, and again, it's worth, we're not trying to put a spin for or against here, but the pound had been falling consistently, as is the Japanese yen and the Australian dollar. That wasn't news. There was a bit of a blip, but to be fair, it kind of corrected within a week or so, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
She also did trail this for the whole of her campaign. We knew it was coming. Mm-hmm. There was the 45% tax rate was a couple of billion out of 60. It was a small bit. That in itself shouldn't have been enough. Is it just then the confidence? Well, we weren't expecting that. If you can drop that last minute, what else could you do?
Yeah.
It's probably more to it. That's probably more what it was than the actual policy itself.
Yeah, I think it was fair to say that people hadn't had the chance themselves to work out if the sums stacked up. Possibly. That might have been the case. And from that point on, it was just kind of like God.
Once panic sets in, it's quite hard to calm down and yeah. Mm-hmm. So is it worth just talking about how economic growth is measured? And some of these things might be complex, but we're going to try and keep it in a way that most people are going to just get.
Yeah.
This isn't meant to be,
It's not meant to be an economics exam. No.
It's not an economics exam. It's a discussion point about the general themes. Mm-hmm. It's also worth saying as well, we're talking about GDP. We get GDP isn't the only measure of how successful an economy is. There's happiness index and different measures that do need to be considered. But as we're in quite a politically and economically kind of time of turmoil, I think it's worth going through GDP and just explaining it. So is it worth just setting out what GDP is in the broad strokes? Then we'll go through
so gross domestic product, GDP, is basically a measure of overall health. It's a very basic health check on how a country is doing in terms of their overall economic health. It kind of measures all of the output of that company, getting down into micro, that country's doing. So products and services they're producing, kind of overall earnings across the entire country from its citizens, and basically comes together and works out an incremental, well, a percentage figure in terms of how much, well, a value essentially of that. And then from that, you measure the economic growth in terms of what your GDP was from one point of time to another. And then that's where you kind of...
So if your GDP was, it doesn't matter what the number is, if it was 100, then it's 101, you've had a 1% growth in GDP.
And I think that's where a lot of people hear these numbers or percentage points and go, well, what does that mean? Exactly.
Because also there's a lot of times when they say we've had a reduction in the rate of growth, that just means the growth rate has slowed, but we still grew.
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of people go, oh no, GDP fell. No, it didn't. It was the rate of growth that fell. So it's worth bearing in mind. Again, it's only ever a comparison against any date you pick in the past. And you can make any number look however you want based on different periods. But
and there's another thing too, because there's also a lot of forecast rates. So the IMF and also like the ONS and
the International Monetary Fund, Office for National Statistics.
I'm jumping ahead here. They all do their own little forecasts, like on economic growth, for the UK or for the wider wide world. And people sometimes revise those forecasts as well. So that's another thing to consider. Is like people may the growth rate may have slowed, but also the forecast growth may have slowed. And again, people might get confused there and go like, oh God, we're like the economy is shrinking. It's like no, we're just not meant to be. We're not expecting to grow as fast as we thought we would. We're still growing ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this is a good point to talk about. Kind of everyone also hears about recessions, and may not fully understand what a recession is in terms of like that is truly when an economy has stopped growing and it starts to reduce its size. And that's only technically the case if there's 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth.
Yeah.
An oxymoron there, negative growth. But
shrinkage.
A shrinkage. I think that
so
sounds
if the size of the economy shrinks,
yes,
2 quarters in a row, we're technically in recession.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can have a slow quarter. It happens probably more than people realise, but
there's amazing how, because a lot of cases where there's an explanation for why some like rates have been slow, and sometimes they put it down to like retail or construction or second-hand car deals. Like these things can have an impact on overall economic growth, and therefore like that's why it's important for business to understand, because they do feed into this wider picture. They may not think about it. They may think it's kind of outside of their kind of control, but they do contribute their small way to it. So
what makes up GDP then? Because I'm looking at the formula here, and this, on the face of it, looks quite complex. But it's, correct me if I'm wrong here. It's government spending.
Yep.
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just break these down as we go. Government spending is part of the sum. We add a few other things to it. We take a couple off. But so if you've got tax reductions, that normally means you're going to have less money to spend.
Yes. Or conversely, if you're spending more money, they need to replenish the coffers somehow. So that's either by cutting stuff elsewhere that maybe they don't see as important, or they're thinking about bringing more tax revenues through the door by putting
different
in
ways.
tax.
So government spend is the first one. You've then got consumer spend.
Yep.
So how much we're spending when we go shopping, the stuff we order, the cars we buy, all of those things are all in that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is within our control, but we can't all just go, we're going to get GDP up this month, right? Empty the bank,
the chancellor doesn't come up and go, can everyone buy, 100 quid from the local shop?
And that's why that's confidence driven, isn't it? Because if people are thinking, well, hold on, am I going to lose my job? What's going to happen? Well, you'll panic.
Yeah.
And I think we saw a lot of this during COVID. It's like, oh, go home, don't worry, what's going to happen? So obviously, I can't imagine loads of people were spending loads of money in those first days. But then once they realised they were getting most of their pay, if they're employed, you actually saw some people spend quite a bit of money on different things, didn't you?
Yeah, and that's why we saw some amazing growth within COVID, because that was that attitude. Everyone went home and went, oh God, we better tighten our belts, and then realised with furlough or the fact that they could actually effectively work from home, they went, well, nothing's changed other than actually my cost of other costs have gone down.
Less to get to work now.
Yeah, I just have to roll out of bed now, so I can spend more money. Yeah, my disposable income's gone up as a result. So
So we bought less fuel, but we probably spent more on line orders and Deliveroo.
Exactly, yeah, and we still saw growth despite that, because there isn't a fundamental trade-off where some stuff you may not spend as much money on, as you said, like fuel, but it gets, providing people don't stop spending, they're going to spend it on something else.
Yeah, still go somewhere else. You've then got investment.
Yeah.
And is this business investment? Is this stuff business does?
Yes. So it's in terms of, there's an element of government investment, but it's mainly, we're talking about kind of investment through business. So that's either coming in from internationally through foreign direct investment, or we're talking about kind of domestic investment from, business owners again. And that's a lot about confidence as well. So people have confidence to feel like they can expand, maybe open another branch, maybe employ more people, for example.
Yeah.
And that obviously has an impact on the wider economy as well.
And this is where it gets complex, because people kind of go, oh, well, if government spending is part of GDP, on the premise we want GDP to go up, I'm not saying we do, but on the premise that GDP going up is generally seen as a good thing, why don't we just spend more money as a government then? Why don't we have a massive state? And the problem there is you can only do that by taking more money out of the other areas.
Yeah.
Because consumers can spend less if you tax them more, and business can invest less if you tax them more. So the trust gamble, from what if I can simplify it as much as I think, then if we take less off you, you'll have more to do things. But the sum of those three elements shouldn't change. And as long as you spend the money we're letting you keep, it doesn't matter that we're spending less. That was the gamble, wasn't it?
That was essentially it, yeah. So they rolled back on proposed increases to corporation tax, obviously cut the higher rate of tax, and the reason behind that was that we're going to get that growth's going to come from elsewhere. That means that people are going to have more, as you said, more disposable income. Businesses are going to have more confidence to invest. So
if we take less off them, they can do more.
Yeah, so that's the idea. So that's the theory behind it. So that hopefully that provides a little bit of context for why it was done, and it wasn't completely mental. Like, it wasn't just completely left field and went, we're just going to burn the rule book.
And again, people misunderstand, or a lot of people don't appreciate perhaps, that as soon as Truss looked like she was going to win that leadership election, the markets are already building this into their decisions, aren't they? So the fact that she trailed this for weeks, we already knew this was coming. What do you think it was that then spooked them? Was it just, there's a little bit more than she said, but we weren't expecting that?
Yeah, I think,
although not financially significant, do you think it was just, well, if you can drop stuff like that and promise more to come, we weren't expecting that bit?
Yeah, it's a case of you're promising this now, and although you haven't given us much notice on a small amount of it, then it shows that you may be a little bit more fluid in your decision making. I was going to say volatile, but that's probably a bit unfair. But a bit more means that you're more willing to make some of these bolder decisions. This time, okay, we had a bit of warning, but what happens next time?
Because she kind of went, and we're going to do more in the end of October or whenever it was, and you think, well, you already did more than we thought.
Yes.
So
what's going to be left?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, because I was very much like, right, well, if we need growth to make this plan work, let's just go for it then. Because why would you not? Let's just double down and go for growth, but then I'm very much like a personal accountability kind of person. I was like, give me the tools and we'll do it.
Yeah.
What else is involved in Jack? So, because obviously, we've got the government spend, we've got the consumer spend, we've got investment. What's the final parts of this puzzle? Because there is more to it, isn't there?
There's one more aspect that we consider in the GDP calculation, and that's kind of our balance between import and export. So if we're exporting more than we're importing, then we're having a positive effect on growth. So people from internationally are buying stuff off us more than we're bringing in, and that's obviously
so there's a net influx of money there, isn't there?
Exactly, yeah, because that's the transfer of goods, and then obviously we're getting the proceeds of those off the back of that, and it's obviously another political issue in terms of like the wider discussions about Britain as a superpower, in terms of like having historically been a very strong manufacturing base, which is then kind of dissipated over the past few decades, and now we're at the point now where we're looking at alternative ways of still retaining that kind of status across the world, and like financial services, for example, are a big thing that we're part of. But still, I think overall, like, our balance of payments here is probably not as strong as it used to be.
Yeah. one thing that was also interesting, again, we mentioned the the pound and the dollar exchange rates. That's good or bad news on an individual level for, if you're going to Disney World, it costs you more for a slushie. I don't mean to make light of any of this, but you get less slushies for your pound. But if you're selling stuff to the US or you're buying stuff, it has a bigger impact. So if you're a business that's buying stuff in from the US, you can now buy less of it. But if you're selling more, you get the same number of dollars, but it's worth more pounds. So these things are never like single issues, are they? And again, I think that's often missed here, isn't it?
Yes, there's winners and losers in terms of,
because we become more economic. If people can get more pound value for their dollar, they're more likely to buy it off us than wherever they were buying it from. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that is a positive for those people selling those things in dollars, isn't it?
And that's why there's an element of balance, because then people exploit the beneficial side of it when things become cheap for you in whatever currency you're trading in. People cotton onto that, and then more people do it, which then drives up the value of the currency, and it kind of equalizes out, and then some other currency. So that's why you're right, it's all of these things are interconnected, and there are kind of, as I said, there are different levers that the government can pull on in order to kind of affect some of these, but they don't affect them in isolation, as I said.
Yeah. Because to be fair then, what you could argue is, what can businesses do about this? Because a lot of this you think, I can't do much about it, and I'm happy to be confident and go for it, but that won't do anything unless it's coupled with the performance, the match and the spend. But if you can be agile and flexible, so if you were selling something that you used to import, but you can't afford to import it now, that means people are more likely to start making it locally. So you just change your supply, change your source, you change your model. Is this a case then if the flexible businesses, the flexible countries on a macro scale can still just adapt and thrive? It just means the thing you used to do, you might not do, but there'll be another opportunity, there'll be something else to do.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when we're dealing with import and export here, is like there's a trade-off there between, obviously buying locally can be more expensive, because if you're comparing producing something in the UK against Taiwan or Vietnam or somewhere like that, where there is strict kind of labour laws and salaries and minimum wages, etc. Obviously, like for like, you're going to have, it's going to be more expensive in the UK. But what you get from the UK is certainty, in the sense that the supply chain is, regular and reliable. You know what you're going to be paying for, and hopefully you'd like to think that it's slightly more predictable. Yeah. Circumstances that now with the global supply chain have made that more difficult. However, when you're dealing with foreign suppliers, is that you have the additional levels of uncertainty of exchange rates, supply chains, lead times and stuff like that, which can always contribute. So that's always interesting. And you're right, like having the agility, within your business to kind of to either flick between the two, or just have the contingencies and plans in place in order to kind of protect your supply chain as best as possible. It's just so important.
Yeah. So this is why a lot of businesses, hedge their finance, don't they? It's, I'm buying stuff in euros or dollars. Well, I'll hedge. I'll insure against the shift in the value, because the thing I'm buying 300 grand's worth of steel from Germany. Well, there's a lead time on that, and you don't know what's going to happen by the time you get there. So a lot of people hedge to go against.
Or just use that opportunity when currency prices are beneficial to them, to then put a load of money into a US dollar account or a euro account for that point where they're going to need to use it again. Yeah. So there are ways of managing it. You're right. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out that we talked about here that's beyond our control, but there is some stuff that we can do.
Of course, in a democracy, we just vote in the people. We can't control government spending, Jack. How dare you suggest we've got no control? But you can't, on a day-to-day basis, there's not much you can do about a lot of these things, is there? So what's the takeaway for business then, Jack? So because we've kind of, hopefully we'll give people an outline. We're not trying to be expert on going into the detail yet, but we'll give an outline of what GDP is, how it's measured on the ground. is the message then, you know, I've mentioned flexibility, is that all you can be? Just make sure you know what's coming. You can't control these things. Be aware though, you might be able to spot the signs.
Yeah, and just what the impacts of some of these levers being pulled have on your business. So, like if we're talking about inflation here, like, well, do I need to start thinking about my pricing? When we're talking about interest rates changing, like, what impact does that have on your cash flow if you've got borrowing? Because suddenly you're going to find that your payments on that loan might go up if they're linked to the base rate of interest.
Yeah.
If we're talking just talking about government policy in general, like we're talking about trade deals and stuff, a lot of these are in the pipeline at the moment. What implication does that have on your industry in the UK?
On your supply lines, possibly, because a trade deal theoretically makes it easier to bring something in from that country.
Yeah.
That might shift where you're buying from. Again, you've just got to be aware of what's happening, haven't you? Do these things affect someone who's completely insulated then, Jack? I can't think of many businesses, but there probably are businesses where everything they do, all of their customers are UK based and all of their supplies that their purchases are all UK based. Do they need to worry then, or do they just keep an eye on the pricing and doing the old, we've talked about hundreds of times, make sure you're pricing right and you're doing your forecasting?
I'd be very surprised if there wasn't even one part of that supply chain which doesn't fall outside the UK, like in terms of production and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, as I said, we're not the superpower that we used to be, so we're not making a huge amount of things. What we are making is fantastic and innovative, but there obviously is some. So it's very hard for any business to fall outside, not need to worry about this.
To exclude themselves from international. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What tip would you give people then who are kind of worried about this, or where would you suggest people go to try and think, well, you know, their advice here is to try and be aware of what's going on? I mean, like, what can people do if they want to know more about this? Because we don't offer courses or training on this. But you know, what should people do? Is it just a case of, you know, start reading the financial press and trying to make sure you know what's going on? Or?
Yeah, I feel like that's a good place to start. It's going to be really flippant if they go and speak to your local MP or something like that, but I can't imagine they're going to provide much help either. But yeah, I think it's just people, I can understand why people can switch off when we talk about this stuff. Politics as a whole, let alone like specific policies, can just turn people off and they can get very irritated by things. But regardless of that, like, there are implications and just being aware of what those potential implications are to your business or to you personally. Like, I can't stress the importance of like understanding what changes the government are proposing, and also taking a balanced view on it, because there is partisan, like, within the press, like, so one side will tell you this.
Depends which paper you read, who you follow on Twitter. Yeah, I saw something yesterday. The people you hit follow on Twitter are the people who are going to drive what you think in future. Mm-hmm. You know, like there's a lot of talk about echo chambers and that, but that happens in the financial world as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's every kind of political side or niche has its own kind of economic policies that go alongside it. So, you know, if you're looking at the right and we're looking at small government, which, you know, a lot of autonomy, and
so they're putting more bias on the business investment and the consumer spend than on the government spend.
Yeah, the government shouldn't be involved in that kind of
Whereas
stuff.
the left kind of go, well, we'll get like the government bit of the GDP, we'll just take all of your money and we'll spend it, but the three will balance in a different way.
Exactly, yeah. So it's
not all your money.
But yeah,
most of your money, I should have said.
So that's the interesting thing. It's like, ultimately, like there is like trade-offs between all of these things. Like every decision will have an impact on all four of those areas of GDP. So it's just weird that can be so divisive when, like, across the political spectrum, that there can be so much disagreement over like trying to get the same answer from, you know, by doing different things. I
think this is one thing that's always quite interesting as well, is that you know, we've probably had like no other time, probably the last 7 years, forecasts of what was going to happen if we voted to leave the EU, forecasts of what would happen when we did eventually leave, and forecasts of what was going to happen in COVID, and actually a lot of people were just very wrong on a lot of these things. It's almost like being in economist who tries to predict what's going on is just like, you're never going to win, so who cares?
Yeah.
Because for everyone who predicted something, there's another, there's someone else who predicted the opposite.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know what my point is about that, but yeah, like, I suppose because I keep coming back to try and do what you can to, you've got to do what you can, take personal accountability for the things within your control.
Yeah.
Be aware of what's going on, but turn up every day, put your all in, and give it a go.
Yeah, and we always talk about it like kind of always focus on the stuff you can control, and like it's very easy. Like I speak to a lot of people that worry about stuff beyond their control, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
So it's awareness of this potential impacts, being aware of those, and preparing for the worst of those impacts as well, and being agile, as we said. That's the most important thing.
Agile and positive.
Agile and positive, yeah.
Good. Well, slightly different episode. We thought we'd do something a little bit topical. We hope that's been of use. As always, we welcome your feedback, any comments, suggestions for future episodes. But until next time, thank you very much. You've been watching Business Stuff with Jack. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.